Welcome, Fáilte Glare, to our Winter Warmer Festival 2020. And tonight I'm delighted to be introducing to you three of our poets, our final set of the festival tonight. Thanks for joining us for the last few days, if you have, and if you're just catching tonight's set, you're very welcome. So tonight we have Florencia Milito, Francisco Grotto, and Emin Marcel. I'm going to dive straight in and introduce our first poet, Florencia Milito. She is one of our along with our Twin Cities Poetry Exchange with that city. There was another poet, Tom Goesson Martin, who read yesterday, was the other poet of that exchange. So we're looking forward to the second of which today. Florencia is a widely published bilingual poet, essayist, memoirist, and translator. She's written extensively on the themes of state terror and displacement, as well as imagination and language as a counterpoint. Influenced by her early experience fleeing Argentina's 1976 coup, subsequent childhood years in Venezuela, and emigration to the United States at the age of 9. She now lives in San Francisco, as I mentioned earlier, works as an educator, and translates the work of contemporary Latin American poets. Her bilingual book of poetry, Itu Sango, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Exiles and Reveries, is the forthcoming from the Nomadic Press in January 2021. So we look forward to your reading, Florencia, and best of luck.
Okay. Hi, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's been really wonderful. And I look forward to the day when we can meet maybe in person, and I can travel to Ireland. I'm going to open with a manuscript that is a work in progress about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She, for those of you who don't know about Sor Juana, she was a 17th century nun, writer, philosopher, playwright, poet, musician. She had the largest library in the Americas. She was Mexican at the time that Mexico was under the Spanish crown. She wrote in Spanish, in Latin, in Nahuatl. She was a proto-feminist who asserted women's rights to scholarly intellectual work. She was likely queer. And all of this got her into trouble with the Inquisition. At the end of her life, she was coerced into renouncing letters, and she died during a pandemic, a plague, taking care of her sick sisters. I've been working on this on and off for many years, and you're going to hear two parts. The original sequence that focuses on her defeat. I was obsessed with this due to my family's history. And then the second part, where I interrogate my original telling of the story. Sor Juana, Mexico, 1694. Dear reader, watch the Inquisition on horseback galloping after our poet, who, weighed down by her habits, arrives at an abandoned carnival, seeks refuge in the hall of mirrors, but instead of her reflection sees a headless Hypatia driving her red chariot around and around. Only a thin sheet of glass separates the two, and Sor Juana is dizzied by the spinning. It had been raining for days that summer, like a tantrum flooding the city, ruining the crops. The people spoke of strange, wide-eyed birds. At dawn, the sky, a sliver of apricot, roaming the garden of the convent, her heart fluttering, miedo, miedo, her drenched robes tight against her breast. She sees a fallen fledgling under the purple jacaranda. Featherless, translucent, its beak so yellow it seems painted on, its tiny neck broken. She reads her fate in the delicate ink of its veins. They say she beat herself so hard she had to be stopped. The archbishop wanted a penitent, not a corpse. Bluebirds circled around her. I think she missed them, those poems, those words. I think they still came to her, spread-eagled, fierce. I think she talked to herself, conjured imaginary tribunals, set everything on fire. But that was at night. Mornings, she got up, washed her face, said her prayers. I'd like to say she turned the sick into poems, that a faint green halo surrounded her dead. Otherwise, she lived those last years without a morsel of magic, ministering to afflicted nuns, obsessively scrubbing away at that invisible birthmark separating her from them. Of Sor Juana, my mother would say, la quebraron. They broke her. In Spanish, the subjects conspicuously absent, more frightening for being implied. Of Sor Juana, my mother would say, la quebraron, the words rolling from her tongue gently, meticulously, like two silver bullets she's afraid to drop. Of Sor Juana, my mother would say, la quebraron, and that would be that. It is something worse than pain or even death. The consciousness, like pink confetti, flutters off bit by bit, like food for the birds. On the examination table, only the body remains, blotched like a forgotten pear, and the mouse, a ventriloquist, gives everything away. As a child, I heard it whispered about my aunt, la quebraron, to explain her peculiarity, her line. It meant she was not right in the head, and all I could picture was my French porcelain doll lying on the cold patio, her pink mouth cracked, her locks gold as mace. What if she was Penelope, weaving and unweaving? What if at the end of the day, after washing and nursing her stricken sisters, they still came to her, those villancicos, sonnets, and conceits? What if, to quiet her mind, she copied them at night, tied them in tiny bundles, burned them at dawn? But if she was Penelope, who was her Odysseus? Perhaps she didn't know whom to expect, nor why they tarried so. Quebrar, to break in half, split in two. History wedges itself inside 4 syllables, la quebraron, and the fit is tight, seamless. California, 2018. And yet, I could have framed this very differently. A resurrection instead of a renunciation, a rising from the ashes. And the weight of history may be less absolute, all-encompassing. Even amidst encroaching darkness, we can never completely know the future. Lately, in this era of mass extinction, I've taken to reminding myself. Every morning I conjure this crack of unknowing, like a small oval mirror, hold it up like an object of meditation. After a protracted winter, fields of mustard yellow bloom. Forgotten for over 200 years, Sor Juana is rediscovered last century. There is hope in this, I think. Then remember Sonnet 151. Sospecha crueldad disimulada el alivio que la esperanza da. She distrusts as disguised cruelty the solace offered by hope. Dear reader, forgive me. For years I could not see beyond her fall, her renunciation. For years I could not see beyond the trickle of dried blood, her signed confession, yo la peor de todas, I the worst of all. For years my mother's la quebraron reverberated across our history, this silence and silencing, tundra-like reptilian of my parents' generation. Dear reader, imagine a hole singed in the middle of the page in the shape of a rose. This is the heart of the wound. What are these images that assault me? Are they sent by the angels? As a child of the dictatorship, the stories that most haunted me were stories of betrayal of others and self-complicity, self-imposed or otherwise, moments in which power reigned absolute. At siesta time, when I see the scars on my aunt's belly, I know not to ask. My cousin and I, young teens at a bookstore in Caracas, she's looking for Cortázar. Someone told her my aunt is named in El Libro de Manuel. In Sor Juana's first dream, jagged edges, a feeling of vertigo. Freed from the constraints of the sleeping body, the soul intellect takes flight. If the body can be broken, maimed, then it makes sense to locate the self, tiny, floating blue feather outside the body. My consciousness has always hovered at eye level, ready for imminent flight. Leaden, guttural, fear can be inscribed in the body, constrict the throat. In the mind, if the mind knows power is not absolute, the body follows its own logic. Dear reader, where do you locate your sense of self? Es cadáver, es polvo, es sombra, es nada. The last line of Sonnet 145 made me fall in love with her a little. Cadences so arresting, they hurt. But I can only give them to you in Spanish. In spite of the most valiant efforts, the translations fall short. A poet writes she could not finish anything until she wrote her demons. Another writes in Spanish, fear cannot be written. Fear is passed on in the mother's milk. The inherited trauma festers in the body, minuscule particles cursing our blood. I harbor my sense of self disembodied in that which can escape the torturer's picana or the prison cell. Dear reader, it is this voice that writes to you now, disembodied, the body like the temporary houses of exiles, temporary dwellings, the thinking, the spirit, eye level, but only as an approximate map. I like to continue with poems from Ituzaingó, Exile and Reveries, which will be the collection that Nomadic Press is publishing in January. I wrote the book in English and then translated myself into Spanish. It conjures some of the personages and places of my childhood and explores the legacy of the dictatorship, of the US-supported 1976 dictatorship, and my complex relationship to the US. Some of the shorter poems I will read in both languages. Song of Exile. Sing to me, child, of ruptures and exiles, the matrilineal inheritance of yellow-eyed felines, bloodstains on scented magnolias that preceded the bees. Canción del exilio. Cántame, hija, sobre rupturas y exilios, la descendencia matrilineal de felinos con ojos amarillos, manchas de sangre sobre magnolias perfumadas que precedieron a las abejas. A Mirta, Caracas, 1979. Now she steals flowers from the neighbors' gardens, waits until siesta time when they are asleep, hides them under her blouse. The thorns from the roses prickle her skin, brush against her scars. Exiled ex-revolutionary turn small-time thief, living out her days under the non-judgmental Caribbean sun, what the caption would read if there were one. Tía Mirta, Caracas, 1979. Ahora roba flores de jardines vecinos, espera hasta la hora de la siesta cuando todos duermen, las esconde debajo de su blusa. Las espinas de las rosas le pinchan la piel, rozan sus cicatrices. ex-revolucionaria exiliada, convertida en ratera de poca monta, viviendo sus días bajo el impasible sol del Caribe. ¿Qué diría la nota de pie si la hubiera? The next two poems are ekphrastic poems. And the first one focuses on an owl. The owl shows up a few times in this book, and it's in the cover of the book, which I'm excited about. It's a sort of spirit animal of sorts for me, I think, and in part it conjures for me sort of the hypervigilance that I think I inherited as part of the legacy of the dictatorship. Close study of detail emboshes the earthly garden of delights. Too much fantastical winged busyness, too many disparate elements clawing for attention. I don't know when to look and where there is to look away. This clamoring and assault, the kind of mental fatigue I feel often these days, making me long for silence and the woods. Verde que te quiero verde. So I settle on a close-up of the fountain, pink, at once strangely futuristic, conjuring kingdoms of glass and mortar, organic like a strange desert plant, some kind of prickly cacti. It feels almost animate. Can you see the ventriloquism of his dancing limbs? And in a close-up, the textures, that circular part where the tiny pygmy owl is perched. I obsess over the perfection of the circle, its grating roundness, the cracks in the pink paint like my aging hand under a magnifying glass, endless rivulets. But it's the tiny owl that captivates, its dark pupils, its yellow irises looking down at a dark blue wreckage of glistening colored beads, translucent vials. Art critics assert the owl is a symbol of darkness, the devil. But I'd like to scoop it in my hands, cup it in my chest, your heart that has seen too much, its beady eyes, its quickened anxiety, all too modern. Once, a poet told me if you were to crack me open, you would find a tiny, glittering owl. That night in Caracas when I was 5 and overheard my parents whispering about my uncle Raúl. Cuando lo mataron. For years afterward, terror was the dark, long overcoats of the generals I had seen in newspaper clippings. Lattice. I want to stay inside this grid, the reds and blues, barbed wire or lattice, and then closure somehow a flight in its tenderness. But in their absence, birds are most present. Those bluebirds of Sor Juana's and the scabs of war are home perhaps, and why so familiar? The blood-brilliant lattice, teeming life, and the sky blue, bright celeste hints of childhood, if barely. Warscape and confinement, true, but also what lies beneath, the possibility of flight and redress, dusty roses, the aftermath of ruins. And for this last poem, it's actually also the last poem in my collection. And I wrote it came out of a response to the political situation in the US, the rising fascism. More specifically came out of just images of the militarized police brutalizing anti-ICE demonstrators, the whole situation with the Supreme Court being in the hands of the extreme right. And it was born out of a moment of extreme anxiety, I would say, and in an attempt to self-soothe. So it's called Lullaby. Eyes and trees, and maybe a bee. I know words will not stop the armies or the tortures, and these days I think of little besides. Still I draw imaginary trees. eyes and trees, and even a bee. Canción de cuna. Ojos y árboles, y quizás una abeja. Sé que las palabras no detendrán ni a los ejércitos ni a las torturas. Y estos días pienso en poca otra cosa. Pero aún dibujo árboles imaginarios, árboles y ojos, y quizás una abeja. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Florencia. It's very, very well read, very captivating reading. And it seems to be a great complexity to, very emotional complexity to your work and to your life. So I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more from you after. So, Marisol de Cuidagwiv, if I may talk to Gavin Tool for us to Gaelga. Thanks to their sponsorship, being made Anvro Dul, as Philly on a Gaeltag de Queranul Div. Agus is Keonacha on Cade Scrivenor Ella. So Prentice McAvard is from Oran Vor in the Donegal Gaeltacht. Tá trí cnúsach filiata fáilte hege, Kamala Cahir Orscale, that's 3 poetry collections of 4 novels published so far, Kamala Lower the Foshti, as well as children's books. Funnig agus Rachtal sé, he's established and he has run on court filiata le Demlina Anuis, agus prona glordúisina ar a héir ag mortas agsúla. His novel Tangrocht was named Irish Language Book of the Year at the Unpost Irish Book Awards on Bhíon Shikata. Foil chauffeur a Cahrú dílam filiata Fólsky níos mula imlíana, so his upcoming poetry collection Fólsky will be published later this year. Gunnar Dorha beg Prentice ag léamh as Gaeilge anocht. There will be English translations printed to be read on screen beside him. So, fáilte rót, Prentice.
Good morning, good. It's more an honour to have been Shaw, agus Corua Isle of a Leo and Shaw, a mask cut in the Valia Sers, from the Chira, agus for the Dawn, Gajevan, agus is Scalanta chance of igum, Mahi and Shaw, agus cut in the Denta Shaw, Rantlev. I'm very pleased and honoured to be invited to read here this year. About 8 or 9 years ago, I read in Cork, and it was a wonderful evening and a really enjoyable reading, and I'm delighted to be back again. And yet then, the first poem I'll read is called Drigu, and Drigu is distillation, and I suppose this poem it deals with the difficulties and the challenges with writing poetry. Tadan fadde ag farsnu in a fark orne in me inshin liblian. Chaim corwer, magina ha fover, spal magrim lina winch. Ahan shin fekim and verig in a leer and lan is pillim na wale. A chucky and wajin riv hacht and yivri, nerves fuir and spal. Givru nis fidjan on, see him a koshchini, le glinja bittelje de yenu no hornle, a heis muchri. And Daradain tost and ishk. This would translate, I suppose, into the silence of fish. I come from a small island in Donegal, and fishing and the life of the sea is very important to the whole island. And sometimes when we're away from home, we can feel a little bit disconnected, especially when we're in a city or a town. So I suppose this is reflecting some of that. Tost and ishk. A mullig Sean a cara ligim scrad na glinter. Chantíam is seálam le scáil na naoine, nuair a siúlam héin na hantíam. Ag draithid í chanal cuairtíam mo had deartha, neatha an tíl fa hing, le go rinhing lám ó rún, ach gan de ragra wutha a tost. Ní lóran an tíos go heilú, a gu agaide cailte ag a wadahin. Ahan anvi a chur cos sa ngáiste yiú. Bhí glór a chasaide ige. Scrad, screch, wul, lú, béc, búr, gar, olagón, drantan, kringan, gion, a chínú héin ag an ilaní bio, ach ní ag gile seo an grinneal. Níl fágad ar nagaid, a sciúg slapper agus sliapperna. Sústal agus lasgu carp, is sin na darint isteach an úr an weis. Bhíú más ar hanga seo a charp, Iantí an tíos go walú ar a strahailt, ar an dasach de léirí sé ar líne, molú na neantra nisha go hanú. Ní eachtar peruet seo na poise, I mollag traléire. Nes an head an le a léhimadív ná cruhanna claphallis, or twilight shapes. Nuair a tad a haith agus chilú réit agad. Go ag siúl ó bhal a chrís go dtí na túrthaí. Tóg art casan croch den sléve, lenach méid a chodjata agad a cuinní, lenach méid a bheitthe agad a plansnag. Agus nuair nach mé rótach an díle a neas, chomtaí is tar a nír. Jan mar seo go méid jarma jant agad, cé acu bal a chrís na na túrthaí doch rial. Jan go sluggan an spéir thir an airige agus an croc, go nólan an céir an ballaga agus boire. Lí sí sa riach, is bí ag saoú in sin sa chlaphallis. Taring hogad an crúsin, a tar de wurnín. Crúhan rodda sin at hagéile wit, an rodda hanti tú o da oige. Crúhan rodda is gyrad a da chrí, crú tinne ag brisú ar charig, crú tratli ar an etchog, crú ellen ag bonna spére. Is na crúhanna sin, agus is na crúhanna sin a wein, is ceartid Lord fasta. And here dan le skrima da Magatherbeg hena. The next poem was written for my son. Chimere Tali. Is tú an gríshi navik. Egelu a ma has a charm an a chruhi madich. Chigil me chinni le chasachar le da heel, is le salas a aga le wanyag na hichidich. Is castle le chimere chali hu, ed a hasu ar chas ieren. Dar lat heen, tatu da waistir ar a chinni. A chri a hash veg, ken waihiad kasa ieren, morable love, ledger, a stúru. Broga, sin an chéad dan le. I wrote this poem about 6 or 7 years ago when we had a tragedy at home, and there's a bit of a tradition when somebody dies, and if they die away from home, that when the body is being brought home on the boat, that the whole community would gather around the pier to welcome the deceased home for the last time. But this was a particularly tragic death, and people weren't able to talk about what had happened. Broga. Siodagin ché a chranní cuid brog an lan. Shan wata sí, an ús an flahag. Trainers on skreg in yer. crach sa hiúlan elín, is braga úr snasta na dúrhi. Wog siad a gompar de godjet a hele, ag córa agus badan hart, ag ran scéalta van amser, van stianagan, van wachtaí an chéir an scalta. Bhí teagmhail acu an dosta, agus clabar an bhalaí mhór, ba bhainnig iad an aber, a gracin leathair closcríbe. Ní roi iad ar iad agus garabhadas an bhalaí, is gan éon aitias arthú an balla héin a lochtú. Ní ra bhálíd an a chláigne, nach róir an náird ag bhad ar na tin ag tséaltú isteach béal éireanna. Ní rós a méil ach osnaí ciúine, agus cónar in a roig ag teata dír. Nes an head an le míl mór Bhrendain scríb mar seo go bli bliana hen ach tá sé bunithe ar achtra Harlan ar a bhí main tág. And when I was a young boy, my father and my uncle took us out to a neighbouring island in a small boat, and there was a small leak in the boat, and me being 7 years old, I took a panic attack. Years later I wrote this. Míl mór Brendain. Saithe vag mas cren me chefne. Tarnithe fríd an ghlaise géig a ghíthe. Ag scailtú ton ag brisú bán a dar tír agus an ispa finne. Sinní niscus na cláirí a haring mohúl ó chhlaise maras ó chlopperge seáil. Dúsa ma hat líana ba róirtar muite is chrom mé ar hímú scafa. Níl spúta go gasar sin a dúirt far a scóid. Ach haring ar muidí ráha is coníana 8 mé godanig muide dír. Drum garú an chladí in a harman. Ag cefniúdú sír in is ar a darlingod, ga cloch mar bharneach ar 1,000 mhór. Tuigim fuisú an bhánaí a chroch éadal a gí sa bhfuair talú tírim fí chos ar muir. Ó hen is mé toirt ai ar na tin tarniam abíd má bhrathar gíl haram. Mar réige ma ahar a tá paidir an níomh, a hanne his fasta is chíche ar an airige mé. Of course, maybe I should have said at the start that that poem is based on St. Brendan, who allegedly discovered America, and the story that when he was on his way to America, he came across an island in the middle of the Atlantic, which I suppose shouldn't have been there. It was turned out to be a whale. And here dan Lehemanis is dan Ur Esha. This is a new poem which will be published shortly. And I suppose it came about because of the recent pandemic. Analu. An chanvan early san hospital, ahan anal stjata kesu. Sweetie she corridors na harmony shinner hogu fasacht anach heki. In a trave she shinner begrale he see vi gran ool sa chil. Bolu curus an air a lina pollery le kivni a hoige. I hen agus bohol doyle. Ag rinch anala le na hele, ag págu agus ag láv se le hele, go cín cos farige. An sin, iad a muad, anal vre ríche na seolte, gi heilje cur briantu, is a chur cusle ag prabu in a gríche. Agus an dón am ag analu a ríchte uras a etchelan na much sketje, Praben an tinil in a tíu, glés a rillion a hanal agus a cusle. Bratníonn si corúr ar an ineag, agus santíon bogu ŵr an air yn mwy. Agus y rhysg cynele a wan a wasgrima le gerid agus bonin chi leis fandom faster. So the next poem is also inspired by the pandemic and the lockdown that we went through recently. Craw folly. Ní léirdú an swastika y scihan, a chlagin ban, a hysgym ade. A teigim gyda fara tesha y mwyhin sin hasan fwyn. Corwr cheg bwylw garas yn ti, a frysw fiw, mo liehid y chwyrtw egi. Ac tamach ra ffoli ffosagam y siamra rwynda tyf hir dy lorgan. Agus bi'n ffosgws na lorhydw. An tála santu dy mahasynj, alien tamils na skeelte, cahian an iliacht an takris anam. Bí me geistet san líche, is cliniam orachar a skélu, dini ag titchim an wohar chrui am wei. Janim irat minu a ails na fakal. Ysgrifam yn Nielan, mae irat fag bri a winches a wylig titchim ma, dohas agus bringla gi a chrwhwdw hen, a weilahu an twignes anam. Tabali an achterhuis, siod am a flwchu. Ac ni ligi an ogla dw amacht, is fanam harman na mutashi vryshu an darish isja. Nish, hier dan alle, dan bydger robog nis briwere agus nis dohasi. Wedig dause. This is a poem I wrote when I was out on my boat. Wedig dause. Mishe agus an arige rinlid dause nu as Kenyon a skere. Ganadring ach urler rinke mo wedge. Honey ma lihi, kashkem chashkem, an reed ar Jonlahan, a gawl in airy agus a casu kjol a rihim na slopperni is la dordan an engel. Hui fuilag hart, a sturian dausa, ag scartu a man a gaman a dar spragul and a glor, run ma lusku lehi slashkem agus lynch, hui ma stjahas a ma shwes agus shis ag kunyal amal a tanta kos. By sin an dausa bair a run ma le blianta, is nur a hannig ma gir, door ma maharish go funwer er mo lanan room, is kai ma pog yn y tro, an is gmew kivnia ki arm, nur a chiefid si a risht, ag yn heli me. Agus beidir, creigna ma shwes leis a dain seo, maybe the last poem we'll just finish up with was, again, set at home, and it was a very, very early morning swim. When myself and a few friends, we decided at the very, very early hours in the morning to swim out to a rock out in the bay. Snow, widening. Sanam adrava sin is mudjan ar stalky ar chrain na lebe. Dúr dunyan chat, gemid chan a chracks na wa maga carig le war. Gan wel vi mudjan ar graken ag brishu free tanta fura na liawanye. Begarger an ween na bokam of rishti gache vi fueg her tra, bachumma ke hannig met harnacht der charig sa huin. Vi farige ar mees an seal a chlachma. Fau shalla veg ni roagum ac ma chraken is carig lum, agus dalti ma iad sa warren at yaw. He much tumult a charig glas, gydigar nachtú bui orge, mer a tani greinje en nyer har hiwe lihij. De scrad is de leem hammoid san iske na huer, is haring bulli leidre ag janúr a chlada. Gan foa cynar nye, a gar fleisur san adar was. Dwi'n cef mi na mo hyn.
Gurmila Walgott, Princess. So sé goni das an a gwylga closhint, agus níos mó trivan fleita. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our final poet of the set and of the night and of the festival, which is Emin Marcel. She's an Egyptian poet, translator, and literary scholar, and professor of Arabic language and literature in the University of Alberta in Canada. She is the author of 5 books of Arabic poetry, selections from which have been translated into numerous languages. In English translation, her poems have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Parnassus, Paris Review, The Nation, American Poetry Review, and Michigan Quarterly Review. Her most recent publications include Arabic translations of Charles Simich's memoirs, A Fly in the Soup, Motherhood and Its Ghost, the following year, and In Pursuit of Enayat al-Zayed, published last year by Al-Kutub Khan of Cairo. And Emin, I apologize for announcing only the English titles, but I wouldn't know where to begin with the Arabic pronunciation, so I'll leave that in your hands tonight. Emin will be reading her poems in Arabic, and our very own Rosie O'Regan will be reading the English translations alongside her tonight. So welcome, Emin.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to read from my Alternative Geography. It's a poetry book that was published in Arabic in 2006. And it was my first poetry book after leaving Egypt to Canada. لماذا جاءت إلى البلاد الجديدة؟ هذه الموضوع موضوع الفرجة. تركض بزينتها في كتان رمادي، حياة متخيلة في فاترينة متحف. أظن أن التحنيط مسألة ضد الخلود، لأن الجسد لن يكون أبداً جزءاً من وردة. المومياء لم تختر هجرتها، بينما هؤلاء الذين انتظروا طويلاً في طوابير السفارات وبنوا بيوتاً في بلاد أخرى يحلمون بالعودة عندما يصبحون جثثاً. يجب أن تأخذونا إلى هناك. هكذا يتركون الوصايا في أعناق أولادهم، كأن الموت هوية ناقصة لا تكتمل إلا في مقبرة الأسرة.
From Alternative Geography. Why did she come to the New World, this mummy, this subject of spectacle sleeping in her full ornament of grey gauze, an imaginary life in a museum display case? I think mummification is contrary to immortality, because a preserved corpse will never be a part of a rose. The mummy did not choose migration, but those who waited in long lines at consulates and built houses in other countries still dream of returning when they become corpses. You have to take us there. This is what they instruct in the wills they hang around their children's necks, as if death is an unfinished identity that matures only in the family burial plot.
لماذا لم ينسوا أنهم من هناك الغرباء الفشلة؟ يدربون عضلات أفواههم على التخلص من اللكنة. اللكنة هي المرض الوراثي الشفاف الذي يفضحهم. يقفز عندما يغضبون فينسون كيف يضعون أحزانهم في لغة أجنبية. اللكنة لا تموت، ولكن الغرباء حفار قبور بجدارة يعلقون على باب الثلاجة أسماء من ماتوا من الأهل حتى لا يخطئوا ويطلبوهم في التليفون، ويدفعون ربع أجورهم لشركات الاتصال ليتأكدوا أنهم موجودون في الفعل في مكان يمكن تحديده ببعده عن الطفولة. لماذا لم ينسوا؟
Why can't they forget that they are from there, these foreign losers who train their jaw muscles to rid themselves of their accents, transparent accents, inherited illnesses that expose them and that leap out of their mouths when they are angry and forget how to place their sadness in a foreign language? Accents do not die, but foreigners are excellent gravediggers. They post the names of their dead relatives on their fridges so not to call them by mistake. They pay a quarter of their wages to telephone companies to make sure they live in a place that can be identified by its distance from childhood. Why can't they forget?
في 6 خطوات فقط يكتب المغترب رسالة ناجحة إلى الأهل. يختار لحظة لا يفتقدهم فيها. يجلس وظهره للشارع لأن الحوائط أكثر حيادية. يوزع السلامات بدقة. يستحضر المجازات التي تربى عليها، المجازات التي ظن أنه لن يلمسها يوما، مثل أحبكم عدد نجوم السماء وعدد حبات الرمال، وأشتاق إليكم كما يشتاق العطشان إلى الماء والعليل إلى الدواء والغريب إلى الوطن. يتفادى ذكر تفاصيله اليومية لأنه لا يعرف كيف سيؤولونها. يكرر الحمد لله كثيرا حتى يطمئنوا على إيمانه.
In 6 steps, the immigrant writes a successful letter to his family. He chooses a time when he does not miss them. He sits with his back to the window because walls are more neutral. He distributes his greetings precisely. He recalls cliches he was raised on, ones he thought he would never use. I love you as much as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the shore. I long for you the way the thirsty long for water, and the ill for medicine, and the stranger for his home. He avoids mentioning details of his everyday life because he does not know how they will interpret them. He repeats, "Praise be to God," to assure them that he keeps his faith.
ما تعلمته هنا لا يختلف عن ما تعلمته هناك. القراءة كتذكرة مرور إلى تغييب الواقع، تخبئة الخجل تحت ألفاظ بذيئة، إخفاء الضعف عبر إطالة الأظافر، تسريب الأرق في التدخين دائما وفي ترتيب الأدراج أحيانا، توفير 3 أنواع من قطرة العيون من أجل توضيح الرؤية ثم الاستمتاع بالعمى، والأهم تلك اللحظة الرائعة من إغماض الجفون على حريق. هنا وهناك تبدو الحياة وكأنها موجودة فقط لتراقب من بعيد.
What you learn here is not different from what you learned there. You read to absent reality. You hide your shyness behind foul language. Camouflage your weakness by lengthening your fingernails. Suppress anxiety by smoking all the time and by organizing and reorganizing the contents of drawers sometimes. Use 3 kinds of eye drops to clarify vision, then enjoy the ensuing blindness. Most important is that wondrous moment of closing your eyelids as a fire breaks out. Here and there, life exists only to be watched from a distance.
في قارة أخرى تركت أعداء مساكين يجب أن تخجل من نفسك عندما تتذكرهم. لا شيء يغضبك الآن. من الصعب أن تقابل شيوعيا كلاسيكيا هنا، حتى أنهم يضعون ساعة في المكاتب العمومية بدلا من صورة الرئيس. ربما يكون كابوسا أن تقضي يوما كهذا تحت تأثير المهدئات. لا شيء جدير بأن تتمرد عليه. أنت مرضي وميت، والحياة من حولك تبدو مثل يد رحيمة أضاءت الغرفة لعجوز أعمى ليتمكن من قراءة الماضي.
On another continent, you left pitiful enemies behind. You have to feel ashamed of yourself when you remember them. Nothing angers you now. It is impossible to meet a classical communist here, and in any case, they hang clocks in public offices instead of the president's picture. Maybe it is a nightmare to spend a day like this under the influence of sedatives. Nothing here deserves your rebellion. You are content and dead, and life around you appears like a merciful hand that lit up a blind old man's room so that he can read the past.
Thank you. I'm going to read 4 poems from 2013 book Until Giving Up the Idea of Home, or حتى أتخلى عن فكرة البيوت. First poem, الشر. كنت أظن أن هناك شرًا كثيرًا في العالم، فرغم أنني أكثر أصدقائي حنانًا، لم أرى وردة على مائدة إلا وطحنت طرفها بين الإبهام والسبابة لأتأكد أنها ليست من البلاستيك. مؤخراً بدأت أشك في وجود الشر أصلاً، لأن الأذى كله يكون قد حدث بالفعل في اللحظة التي نتأكد فيها أن الكائنات التي أدميناها كانت حقيقية.
Excuse me. Evil. I used to think there was a lot of evil in the world, for although I am the most tender of my friends, I never saw a flower in a vase without crushing its petal between my thumb and forefinger to make sure it was not made of plastic. Lately, I've started to doubt the very existence of evil. It seems to me that all the harm will have already been done by the time we find out that the creatures we bled were real.
من النافذة. من الممكن أن تميز الشخص الذي تحطم من قبل. الشخص الذي بعد أن تحطم نجحوا في تثبيت ظهره أو ربط عنقه بالكتفين. من وقفتك هذه تشرب القهوة وتتابع العابرين، قد تخمن شكل الشريان الذي نقلوه من معصمه إلى قلبه، أو تلمح لمعان المسامير التي استوردوها من أجل الركبة. سترى بوضوح إخلاصه لخطوته، بطيء ربما، ويمشي عادة في خط مستقيم. لن يلتفت نحوك فترى عينيه مثلا، إنه مغلق بإحكام. الأمر سيكون أسهل مع شخص تبعثر من قبل. الشخص الذي تبعثر من قبل عادة ما يتلفت حوله كأنه يبحث عن جزء ما زال ضائعا منه، وقد يبدو في التفاتته حلوا جدا لأنهم ألصقوه بالصمو، أو مرا بعض الشيء لأنه يبالغ في إضافة الغراء ليسد فجوة بين عضوين. لا أظن أنك من زجاج النافذة يمكن أن تدرك هؤلاء الذين تمزقوا من قبل. لا شيء يميزهم في الحقيقة. أقصد ربما كل منهم لا يشبه إلا نفسه، مثل ملصقات مختومة تم نزعها من أغلفة المظاريف وانتهت عند هواة جمع الطوابع.
The window. You can identify the one who was broken, the one whose spine they managed to straighten, whose neck they stuck back on his shoulders. From where you stand, drinking coffee and watching the passers-by, you can guess at the line of the vein they threaded from his wrist to his heart. You can see the glint of the imported surgical pins. You will see how carefully he takes his steps, walking slowly perhaps, usually in a straight line. He'll never turn around for you to see his eyes. This one is sealed tight. It will be easier with one who is blown apart. The one who is blown apart often turns round, as though looking for a part he's still missing. He sometimes smiles sweetly because they've stuck it on with gum, or frowns bitterly because he's used too much glue in plugging the space between two limbs. I don't think you can make out from the window the ones who are torn to shreds. There's really nothing to distinguish them. Or else, each of them looks just like himself, like cancelled stamps unfixed from their envelopes that ended up in some philatelist's album.
وقع خيط القصة في الأرض فنزلت على ركبتي أبحث عنه. كان هناك ذلك الاحتفال الوطني ولم أرى إلا الأحذية المستوردة والبيادات. على مقعد في قطار قالت لي أفغانية لم ترى أفغانستان الانتصار ممكن. تمنيت يومها لو سألتها هل هذه نبوءة؟ بدت تهتهتي بالفارسية كأنها خارجة من كتاب المبتدئين، وهي كأنها تلتقطها من خزانة ملابس قتل صاحبها في حريق. لنفرض أن الشعب وصل عن بكرة أبيه إلى الميدان، أن الشعب ليس كلمة قبيحة، كما أن لا أحد يعرف ما معنى بكرة أبيه. إذن كيف حضرت كل هذه الكلاب البوليسية إلى هنا؟ ومن غطى وجوهها بأقنعة ملونة؟ الأهم من ذلك، أين سقط الخيط الذي يفصل بين الأعلام والملابس الجنسية والملابس الداخلية، بين الأناشيد والنشيج، بين الله وكائناته التي تمشي على الأرض لتدفع الضرائب؟ الاحتفال. كأنني لم أنطق هذه الكلمة من قبل، كأنها خرجت لتوها من قاموس إغريقي، حيث رجع أهالي سبارتا منتصرين إلى سبارتا، ولم يجف دم الفرس على التروس والرماح. ربما لم يكن هناك قطار ولا نبوءة ولا أفغانية جلست أمامي لساعتين. أن الله يضلل ذاكرة مخلوقاته من وقت لآخر ليتسلى، ولكن المؤكد أنني من موقعي هذا بين الأحذية والبيادات لن أعرف من بالضبط انتصر على من.
Celebration. The thread of the story fell to the ground, so I went down on my hands and knees to hunt for it. This was at one of those patriotic celebrations, and all I saw were imported shoes and jackboots. Once, on the train, an Afghan woman who had never seen Afghanistan said to me, "Triumph is possible." Is that a prophecy? I wanted to ask, but my Persian was straight from a beginner's textbook, and she looked, while listening to me, as though she were picking through a wardrobe whose owner had died in a fire. Let's assume the people arrived en masse at the square. Let's assume the people is not a dirty word and that we know the meaning of the phrase en masse. Then how did all these police dogs get here? Who fitted them with party-coloured masks? More important, where is the line between flags and lingerie, anthems and anathemas, God and his creations, the ones who pay taxes and walk on earth? Celebration, as if I'd never said the word before, as if it came from a Greek lexicon in which the victorious Spartans march home with Persian blood still wet on their spears and shields. Perhaps there was no train, no prophecy, no Afghan woman sitting across from me for 2 hours. At times, for his own amusement, God leads our memories astray. What I can say is that from down here, among the shoes and jackboots, I'll never know for certain who triumphed over whom.
Before my last poem, I just want to mention that the poems I'm reading today, first one, Alternative Geography, translated by Khalid Mutawa, The Evil, translated by Yusuf Raha, the Egyptian poet, and the last 3 poems include, and the last one as well, are translated by Robin Creswell. فكرة البيوت. بات أقراطي في محل الذهب لأشتري خاتما من سوق الفضة. استبدلته بحبر قديم وكراسة أسودة. حدث ذلك قبل أن أنسى الصفحات على مقعد قطار كان من المفروض أن يوصلني إلى البيت، وكان كلما وصلت إلى مدينة بدا لي أن بيتي في مدينة أخرى. تقول أولغا من دون أن أحكي لها ما سبق: البيت لا يصبح بيتا إلا لحظة بيعه. تكتشف احتمالات حديقته وغرفه الواسعة في عيون السمسار. تحتفظ بكوابيسك تحت السقف نفسه لنفسك، وسيكون عليك أن تخرج بها في حقيبة أو اثنتين على أحسن الفروض. أولغا تصمت فجأة ثم تبتسم مثل ملكة تتباسط مع رعاياها بين ماكينة القهوة في مطبخها وشباك يطل على زهور. زوج أولغا لم يرى مشهد الملكة، وربما لهذا لا يزال يظن أن البيت هو الصديق الوفي عندما يصبح أعمى. أركانه تحفظ خطواته، وسلماته ستحميه برحمتها من السقوط في العتمة. أبحث عن مفتاح يضيع دائما في قعر الحقيبة، حيث لا تراني أولغا ولا زوجها، حيث أتدرب في الحقيقة حتى أتخلى عن فكرة البيوت. كل مرة تعود إلي وتراب العالم على أطراف أصابعك، تحشر ما استطعت حمله في خزائنه. مع ذلك ترفض أن تعرف البيت بأنه مستقبل الكراكيب، حيث أشياء ميتة كانت قد بدت في لحظة ما تفاوضا مع الأمل. ليكن البيت هو المكان الذي لا تلاحظ البتة إضاءته السيئة، جدار تتسع شروخه حتى تظنها يوما بديلا للأبواب.
The idea of houses. I sold my earrings at the gold store to buy a silver ring in the market. I swapped that for old ink and a black notebook. This was before I forgot my pages on the seat of a train that was supposed to take me home. Whenever I arrived in a city, it seemed my home was in a different one. Olga says, without my having told her any of this, your home is never really home until you sell it. Then you discover all the things you could do with the garden and the big rooms, as if seeing it through the eyes of a broker. You've stored your nightmares in the attic, and now you have to pack them in a suitcase, or two at best. Olga goes silent, then smiles suddenly, like a queen among her subjects, there in the kitchen between her coffee machine and a window with a view of flowers. Olga's husband wasn't there to witness this regal episode. Maybe this is why he still thinks the house will be a loyal friend when he goes blind, a house whose foundations will hold him steady and whose stairs, out of mercy, will protect him from falls in the dark. I'm looking for a key that always gets lost in the bottom of my handbag, where neither Olga nor her husband can see me drilling myself in reality so I can give up the idea of houses. Every time you go back home with the dirt of the world under your nails, you stuff everything you were able to carry with you into its closets. But you refuse to define home as the future of junk, a place where dead things were once confused with hope. Let home be that place where you never notice the bad lighting. Let it be a wall whose cracks keep growing until one day you take them for doors.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iman and Rosie, for the readings. They were extremely beautifully jarring poems, translations. I am going to ask you all a few questions now, if you're happy with that. I suppose, despite residing in all different parts of the world, perhaps what unites you all, or what unites your practices, might be the act and the involvement of translating poetry. So I suppose my question to each of you initially would be, I suppose, how does your relationship with a piece of work change as it's translated, if it does? So I might start with Florencia, if you'd like to answer first.
Yeah, let me. So for me, well, the last thing that I've been working on was translating my own work, and that has been a healing process. I mean, I think that there's always something that is lost, but for me, it's also there's been something that is gained. Even just, you know, I wrote my first poem in Spanish before I knew English, and then at some point, English became my literary language because I came to the U.S. When I was quite young. So there's something about the process itself of translation either when I'm, you know, in this case, translating myself, or when I've translated other Latin American poets that is a deeply psychological process for me, I suppose, and besides the having the recreation of a poem in Spanish, in English, if I'm translating from Spanish to English, or in this case, in Spanish, there's something about that space that makes me feel less fragmented, if that makes sense. And I don't know if that answered your question, you know, because I don't know if you're asking specifically my relationship to the poem, that, you know, the product in some ways, and I'm interested in that and that recreation, but also for me there's something about the process itself. Yeah.
For sure, yeah. I think the question can definitely go in whichever direction you interpret it. But that's very interesting to interpret in terms of this a spatial thing as well. I can definitely relate to that. And Proinsias, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, well, I write in a minority language, and because the Irish language is so much under threat, you know, there's a lot of you know, the English language and the Irish language in a lot of ways coexist and meld into each other in the normal everyday talk of people in the Gaeltacht areas and whatnot. When I'm writing, I sometimes have difficulty translating because there are ideas that don't translate well. There are expressions and colloquialisms and idioms that are very difficult to translate into the second language. But then when you do make the effort to translate, or when you, better still, if you read somebody else's translation, sometimes it leads to, you know, an extra layer of examination that, whereas I might have examined a topic in my own language, sometimes when you read another person's translation of it, they bring something different. They see something different that maybe I hadn't intended. Or if I translate my own work, sometimes I get the opportunity to maybe use a word that brings another level of understanding to what was originally there. So it's a very interesting process, and I think it's a useful process as well to translate as widely as possible, because every language has its own registers, and I work between Irish, I work in Irish, but I translate to English sometimes. But, you know, somebody translating to French maybe would find other registers and other meanings, and I think it's all very good.
For sure. Emin?
I actually will think about your question as a young reader. I used to enjoy reading translated poetry from all over the world, and I think translation can make poetry universal, as it should be. So reading poets from Eastern Europe or Korea, and it would be impossible really without the art of translation. So this makes me feel like we should let go with the translation of our own poetry, not to be to have an anxiety about the translation or our work in translation, because I assume that a poem can be great and can have a different life in different language. So it doesn't belong to us anymore, really, after we wrote it.
Sure. And I suppose with all translation, there's there's something deeply personal about writing poetry in particular in your mother tongue, and then with translating, it's definitely infused with accessibility and kind of being able to spread the work. So with that, and I know, Florencia, one of your first poems you addressed the reader, and I was kind of wondering, with the translating, with the accessibility, is the reader or the listener something you think of while you're writing? How important is it in your writing process? Or is it really a personal thing?
I don't know how to, I've thought about this and I don't know exactly what I think, to be honest. I think I have an imaginary reader. I'm obviously, I don't know that I have specific reader in mind, especially when I write poetry. Sorry, my kids are in the background, but so I feel, so I think that, there is definitely the sense of communicating to this reader, but not necessarily. I don't know if it's if this reader is somebody, very specific in my mind, right? It's I don't know how embodied this reader is, but there's definitely the sense of a reader, if that makes sense. I don't know,
Sure, I think it does in its own way, for sure. Proinsias, the same question.
Yeah, I think when you're writing a poem, I think that in the first instance, I think you have to write it for yourself. I don't know how useful it would be to have a reader in mind when you're writing the poem for yourself. That could be very different now, maybe if you're writing a novel or something else. But in the case of poetry, I think it's important that that you write for yourself, and then perhaps in the revision process, and any poet will tell you that any poem goes through 10, 20, 30 different versions before it becomes a finished poem. And in the process of revision, in the process of rewriting, in the process of polishing a poem, then perhaps the poet might think of the reader and who's going to listen to this poem, and will the reader understand? So I think in the actual initial stages of the writing, I think the poet should concentrate on himself. For me, anyway, that's the way I would think. But perhaps in the revision and when it comes close to publishing, maybe the ear of the reader might come into play a little bit more.
For sure, yeah, it's a great answer. And Emin?
I don't really think about it. Sometimes you feel you are part of a conversation with a friend while you are writing, and sometimes it's a completely solitary moment. But I remember that this notion came to my mind when I was writing my first poems after leaving Egypt. Like after a few years without writing any poems, I started to write alternative geography. And I have some thoughts about it. I felt really I'm writing poems to no one, because I'm writing it in Arabic to people who read in Arabic, who supposedly live back home, but I'm writing it about also Canada and the snow and being an individual in this new environment. So I think with this book in particular, I used to feel like I'm talking to myself, which luckily wasn't the case after the book came out, but I was thinking about it, I guess, but usually not really.
Sure. Thank you. I'd like to ask you another question since we have a little bit of time. So, Emin, I read just in your bio that you work in university, and Proinsias, you have worked with some children's books. And Florencia, you mentioned you have some children running around the house at the moment. So I'm kind of curious what your opinions are in terms of, I suppose, how poetry adapts to kind of, I suppose, access or facilitate a kind of younger audience, or, you know, as far as children. I suppose all our listeners are very familiar with the darkness and the heaviness that poetry can access, which can be quite cathartic. But do you think that's something necessary to touch on for a younger reader? I'll start again with Florencia. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Look, I hope I understood your question. I definitely, I mean, not only do I have children and who write poetry, actually, I've taught poetry. I've worked with children a lot in poetry, teaching poetry to children. So, and I feel like, and I know for me as a child, in some ways, my grandmother, when we were in Venezuela, she would, you know, read poetry and recite poetry out loud. And that really marked me, you know, in many ways. So, and I've worked with children where I mean, I feel like if you expose them to poetry, they can respond very deeply, and they can go to places sometimes in their imagination, especially when they're young, you know, before they become self-conscious of themselves as writers, that are very surprising, you know. I read Lorca to my youngest daughter all the time when she was little. You know, so, and it's dark, but I think yes, but you know, then so is the world, right? I mean, and it's also not dark, and I think, you know, she writes, and I think that probably had an effect, you know. I don't know if that answered your question, but I definitely feel like I don't think children should be only exposed to poems written for children. If that's, you know, I definitely think that they can be exposed to, and they're not going to necessarily, you know, understand all of it in the same way, I suppose, if that's, I mean, there are different levels, right, of that we, but I think the rhythms, the images, just the sounds, you know, I'm sure, I mean, I'm sure my daughter was influenced by Lorca, you know, because she heard a lot of, you know, so.
For sure. And are they fans of your own poetry?
Yes, you know, how could, yes, they're both very supportive. I have a 13-year-old and a almost 7-year-old.
Okay, great.
And
Proinsias,
kind of and stuff. So
great, thanks for sharing that. Proinsias, what's your own approach on poetry for children, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I would agree with Florencia there a lot. I think that you know, for children, and I have 3 young children as well. My oldest is 14, and I teach children day in, day out. So for a child, I think poetry is a very natural thing. I think that there's a very, very small difference, if there's any difference at all, between song and poetry. I think they're almost the same thing. And what does a young child do but sing? That's how we teach children when they're small. We teach them rhymes, we teach them songs, and what's that but poetry? And I think poetry is a very natural way for children to understand things. Simple metaphors, simple similes. This is how children learn, and everybody knows that because every culture in the world sings songs and sings lullabies to children, and that's poetry. What else is it but poetry? So, of course, poetry is essential for children's development and for children's understanding. Now, the challenge maybe is when they get a little bit older. Like my oldest is 14 now, and maybe the last thing in the world she wants to do is to sit down and listen to poetry or to read poetry or whatnot. But if we can manage to integrate it into their lives, because it really is. It's been part of their lives since they were born. We sing to our children from the moment they're born.
Thanks, Francesca. It's a lovely thought and way to look at it. I suppose as children are kind of building the languages themselves from scratch, I suppose there's definitely a lot of accidental poetic terms that can come out in that process as well of building. And Emin, what are your thoughts on this subject?
I really agree with both of them. Like, I think they articulated my answer very well.
Great. I'm going to wrap it up there, guys. Is there anything that you'd like to add yourselves, or anything that you'd like to say before we close off ourselves? Just to give you the opportunity. Okay, I'm just going to say thank you all very much for your readings and for sticking around to answer some questions there as well at the end. It was lovely to meet you virtually, and I just want to say hello and how are we getting on to all of our audience as well at the moment. And I'm sure your applause for your readings tonight is spread very thinly around the place, so we can't even hear it from here. So there's one or two things to mention before we close off tonight. One is that our fourth 15-minute mini concert that we screened earlier today, there's a little bit of interference with it. So the good news is we are going to stream it again directly after this reading. So we'll have a little bit of Kjol to wind us down tonight. So I hope you enjoy that. And as well, all the events all weekend have been free. So as usual, Ovale really accepts any donations that you have. If you're watching in the future, there should be a button directly above our heads for donations. So we appreciate anything that you can contribute there. And just to remind you that you can revisit any of the readings throughout the festival on our Vimeo page or at ovale.ie/winterwarmer. So I want to say thanks again to Florencia Milito, Princess McAvoyard, and Emin Marcel. So I hope you keep very well in the next few times. So I'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's long a fall.
Bye. I hope we all get to meet.